So I think that we can move to our speaker, Robert Stone. Yes, perfect. We can see.
Can you see the slide presentation?
I don't think that it was slide.
Let's look. Screen one, screen two. Can I share? Is it possible to share now?
It is possible. You can share.
Okay. Excellent. That looks correct. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Good. Good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Peter, my good friend too. In fact, you've stole my first slide, but I'll come to that in a second, because we do go back many years, many decades, in fact, which is I think it's nice to see that some of us are still going in the virtual reality community. I tried to take semi-retirement in 2019, but as anyone who works in this area knows, once you're part of the metaverse, there is no escape. So I'm still doing it. But yes, I certainly big vote of thanks to Peter and Professor Shukshanov. What he didn't mention was that this picture has now become known across the water as the Three Amigos, because indeed we've worked together throughout a number of important years, and I think it's important that that's recognised, because a lot of our early work fed into what Peter and Professor Shukshanov were doing to try and help introduce this technology into the cosmonaut training center at Star City, who are now, of course, because of the wonderful work that's going on in Novocherkassk, have built up a really internationally excellent center. And as Peter mentioned, yes, I mean, my one big memory is that. Being made an honorary Cossack. I don't think I shall ever forget that. In fact, I remember being presented at that event, and I still have it, with this. This was presented to me during the ceremony, and it was presented to me by someone who said, "This whip is for your horses, and this whip is for your wives." Now, I'm not even going to talk about that, because she's next door, and I have to be very careful. So also I'd like to thank Professor DeMarco and Professor Harfouche, because they've kind of set the scene for some of my comments about where we've been in the last 35 years. And the two words that came from their presentation were obviously user-centered design, human-centered design, and multidisciplinary. And I think those two are absolutely crucial to my presentation, and multidisciplinary involvement, involving stakeholders throughout every phase of the development of VR projects is absolutely crucial. And this really, I mean, I still run a small team called the Human Interface Technologies team at the University of Birmingham. And as Peter mentioned, we're involved in defense. So we're looking at defense robotics, for the control of or the disposal of explosive ordnance and bombs. We do a lot of work on mixed reality, and I'll define this later on. Mixed reality for things like command and control, submarine training. We've done a lot of work in aerospace. For example, this is the visualization of the Royal Air Force's new Tempest fighter concept, underwater diving, patrol training for the Army. My passion, as Peter well knows, is heritage, because I believe, and again, this was mentioned in the previous presentation, I think Antoine mentioned this very early on, is that virtual heritage or heritage studies is about making the invisible visible. It's bringing to, for example, the eyes of the general public something that existed many decades, centuries ago, and making it visible and accessible in a form that they can understand. So underwater work, for example, with the wreck of the A7 submarine, which is pre-World War I, augmented reality. We do a lot of work on Dartmoor in the west of the country, which is incredibly rich in industrial archaeology. And we continue to try and push forward the boundaries of exploiting other forms of sensory data, such as sonar data, in order, again, to visualize what people can no longer see, such as wrecks on the seabed. Very important. I'll come on some of those in a second. Healthcare, again, as Peter mentioned, is a major involvement for us. And this is where my background in psychology and human factors really comes into its own. It's how do we know that we're delivering appropriate technology into what can be a very frail, a very vulnerable environment, and not compromise their already existing health issues. So we've been doing some work, for example, on the use of virtual reality to deliver scenes of nature into hospitals that are in inner cities, urban areas where they have no nature, where they have no green, where they have no ocean, and that's been quite successful. And also using that for post-operative rehabilitation, so for linking up standard medical pieces of equipment in order to help people rehabilitate and improve their limbs, improve their diaphragm, improve their body functions after they've come out of traumatic surgery. And more recently, particularly during the COVID crisis, we've been looking at using scenes of virtual nature. And this is a project by one of my students that is currently being used for ambulance services. It's being evaluated in the States. It's becoming very popular, and it's been developed recently for the Oculus Quest 2 headset, so it's now standalone. But we've had the fantastic support of Sir David Attenborough in providing the narration for this 15-minute relaxation scene. So that's who we are. We are also, I think, like Antoine was saying, his team is tiny, my team is tiny, and we try to do an awful lot of research and work on very limited budgets, because it's still the case that in the UK and indeed across most of Europe, that people are still saying, well, virtual reality, what's it all about? Is it really for me? And I think it's been now confused by the fact that we're talking about things like the metaverse. I mean, most of you will have seen copious mentions of the metaverse, and we'll come on to that if I have time towards the end. So what do I mean by extended reality? In many respects, extended reality, or XR, is a bit of a marketing term that's evolved recently. But to me, it comprises virtual, augmented, and mixed. And the case study I'll give at the end in a little bit more detail will explain, I hope, what the power of mixed reality going forward, to make sure that we deliver appropriate technology that is fit for human use. I think that's very important. This continuum you can see here by Milgram and Kashino back in 1994. A lot of people quote this. I believe it's had its day. It does actually hint at mixed reality joining the real with the virtual, which is fine. But mixed reality to me is more replacing this crazy term that they use called augmented virtuality, which actually is meaningless. But mixed extended reality comprise these three areas. Virtual reality is all about interacting with computer-generated databases, historically and predominantly visual, but of course nowadays we've got things like haptics, we've got things like smell, spatial sound, all kinds of different senses are being bombarded by these somewhat outlandish technologies that again tend to be put onto the market without understanding the impact on the human user. And I'll come on to that in a second. But of course, the important thing is, as we'll see later on, is that virtual reality is not just about headsets. It's not just about trying to immerse people in a computer-generated world. There are other technologies that do that. It's all about the content. And I think that's important to take on board. So we can immerse people into virtual environments using screens. Absolutely no reason why not. You've got some examples of our projects from the very recent past. Just earlier this year, we concluded the Mayflower Project. And as you know, the Mayflower set sail in 1620 to take the Pilgrims, or the separatists, from England over to the New World, and landing at Plymouth in Massachusetts. And that was quite a challenging project. And I know this is a little bit loud. in that we found that the vision of, even though the graphics and the quality was very high, the vision and the sound wasn't enough. There was definitely something missing from this project that and having it interface with many of the public, we found out that what they wanted to do was they wanted to enhance their experience by smell. So we were able to team up with the American company OVR Technology, who very kindly loaned us 2 of their ion systems, which are tiny, almost printer cartridge size devices, which produce smells which are up to 9 smells and actually vaporize them in front of your nose. Very interesting technology, very immature stage of development, but this is probably the best implementation that I've seen of this technology in the last few years. And when we tried it out on the public, it increased their immersion, I would say, threefold. They were actually able to smell, well, some of the smells in the 1620s were very, very bad. They were not very nice at all. But that added to the level of immersion and the level of believability. So the Mayflower project, as an example of VR plus VR with these new sensors, was very, very successful. But VR can be used for so much more, and I think this is one of the areas we hope to take it much further. This again is an area in the West Country where I was born. This is a man-made reservoir, and using an autonomous surface vessel, we were able to scan this area and to take the multi-beam sonar data and convert it into a virtual reality fly-through. And we found these very strange artifacts. We found a lot of historical remains, but we found these very strange, almost man-made smooth objects. So by sending down one of our ROVs, we actually discovered, and this was not known by the local people, again showing the power of this technology. It was not known that in World War II, they actually placed a whole series of anti-torpedo nets. There's the nets. They still exist to this day. They're like large chainmail nets suspended under these spheres. And using our little ROV, guided by the virtual reality recreation, we were able to find these and report back to all the local villagers. And they were just amazed. They had no idea that that dam holding back that water could have been taken away with a simple torpedo in World War II. Using drones, we use drones quite a lot with our students, and for example, not just to do three-dimensional recreations of historical sites. This is an old granite quarry, again on Dartmoor, but also, for example, by one of my colleagues took this DJI drone, connected, endowed it, if you like, with a radiation sensor. So it was the B Geigy sensor that they used in Japan to monitor radiation problems after the tsunami hit Fukushima. But using that, we were able to map the extent to which radon was being emitted by quarries and by the tors. The tors are these large structures that have been weathered down over the years and are made of granite. And so we were able to map, just using simple technology, the amount of radiation that was being emitted in key areas of Dartmoor. Other forms of virtual reality not to be ignored include, for example, what we call Panoramic Vr. So this is 360 cameras. The Ricoh series is the one that we use here, the Ricoh Theta Z1, which also produces almost like a LiDAR laser scan representation, 3D scan of the area. So here you can see we are in fact in Drakes Island near Plymouth, and this Matterport scanner is giving us a three-dimensional walkthrough of the tunnels, the Victorian tunnels that are basically follow that line that I'm showing on the upper screen from the drone recreation. To model this using graphics would take forever. It would be too expensive, far too prohibitive. So again, it's not just about headsets, it's not just about 3D graphics, it's about using the most appropriate tools to generate the most appropriate content. And we've done that, we've also done it recently by combining the two for this, which is a Cold War nuclear submarine exhibit, HMS Courageous, where we were using a very basic three-dimensional model of the submarine in a very James Bond looking hangar. But using these 3D cameras, you can then map out the very, very complex areas that would be far too expensive to model. And here's one for Peter, because he hasn't seen this one before. We recently did exactly the same on a Russian Foxtrot submarine that again is a very old exhibit moored in the River Medway, just east of London. And we were given permission to go on the submarine and to do some drone footage and to do some 3D scanning inside the submarine. And we were able to capture the entire submarine in less than 1 day. So again, it's all about rapid generation of content and releasing that content to people who, for example, the elderly or the disabled, people who cannot go on board the submarine, people who cannot go in these caves, and present it to them so that they can explore. So very, very powerful, very, very powerful indeed. Augmented reality is, despite what you see online, lags behind virtual reality in terms of its maturity. Augmented reality uses different kind of trigger techniques, be it GPS, be that fiducial markers, be it, for example, recognition of specific structures, to take the virtual, to take the 3D information or multimodal information, and then to superimpose it onto the real world to enhance the understanding of that virtual world. And the reason I say it lags behind is not because of the technology and the techniques, but because of the headsets. The headsets are fine if all you're hoping to display at the moment are very simple symbols, maybe small thumbnail videos or other pieces of very focused information. But as soon as you take it outside, as we tried here, with the aim of being able to see the Mayflower in its original point of sailing, you can see from the shot that I took through the headset itself, it's useless. And I think when you see people online talking about augmented reality, you have to think, well, yes, this all sounds very, very good, but we've tried this in the real world. And guess what? In the real world, in the outside world, and I don't care whether it's this, or it's HoloLens, or it's Magic Leap, or it's Apple's new device, it doesn't work. And that's something which I believe is holding the technology back. The content and the superimposition of models on the real world is not an issue. It's not a problem. Here we have we were using basically a webcam with the laptop, and we were able to sail. We're going to be able to see the Mayflower sailing. Okay, it's not perfect. We were trying to look at how best to model the physics of the wake and the reflection. It's far too gross in this picture, but it was a good experiment to just to see what we could use to develop augmented reality that is based on outdoor scenes. And then finally, mixed reality. Again, if you go online, mixed reality is one of these confused terms that's being used everywhere. Microsoft uses it for the HoloLens. The HoloLens is not a mixed reality headset; it's an augmented reality headset. They've been referenced over many years to the mixed reality, virtual reality headset. So Lenovo, Asus, Hewlett-Packard, and so on, all referred to as mixed reality headsets. They're not. And hopefully, as I go into the rest of the presentation, you'll understand why people get confused, but mixed reality has a very, very basic and very, very promising definition and future. Mixed reality, given the state of play we have at the moment with VR and AR, mixed reality is making the most of the real to make the virtual believable. So it's kind of the inverse of augmented reality. So for example, here you see a 3D model of the inside of a Royal Marines hovercraft. Here you see a picture of a real live physical casualty on a physical stretcher. And we'll see a little bit more of this later on. Using pass-through camera techniques, we use the HTC Vive in a single camera. This is the rather expensive but quite impressive Vario XR3. I'm quite excited for the Lynx R1 headset that is due out in 2022. The sooner the better. But we can blend the real with the virtual, so you see your real hand, you see the real mannequin, the casualty, and when you touch the mannequin with your hand, you feel that sensation instantly. And again, you'll become aware of my criticism of existing haptic feedback gloves in just a second. So you can see your colleagues, you can see your hand, you can see your body, you can see the most important parts of the training, but all around you is the virtual scene, in this case, the virtual hovercraft. And this is where the confusion arises. People come to me almost every week and say, well, what do I use? I mean, there's all this stuff on the internet and all this hype, and this works and that works, and this is fantastic, and this is wow, and this is OMG, and what do I use? People read that augmented reality will be better than VR in the near future. It won't. It's a different kind of tool for a different kind of applications. You must have a headset to benefit from VR, mustn't you? No, you don't. Doesn't VR make you sick? 3 to 5% of the population? Yes, it does. but in the main, there are ways in which you can mitigate any risks from what people call cyber sickness. VR has only been around for the past few years, hasn't it? Since Lucky Palmer, or Palmer Lucky, whatever he's called, brought out the Oculus. No, it's been around since the late 1980s. It's not new. It's not new at all. And Peter knows this because we've been part of the journey. VR is too expensive, isn't it? Back in the 1990s, and again, Peter will remember this. Yes, it was. It was prohibitively expensive. Today, we're doing the same things on a low-cost laptop, and even on a standalone headset that we did using a £250,000 UK graphics supercomputer back in the 1990s. Is it just a form of gaming? Well, maybe it is, but we have a lot to thank the gaming community for, particularly at the turn of the century, in terms of what they did to bring very affordable, very accessible toolkits and graphics acceleration cards, graphic processing units onto the market. How do I make sure I choose the right tech for my users? And that comes on to, for example, what Professor Harfouche was talking about and Professor DeMarco, user-centered design. We'll talk about that in a second. And do I need to consider other senses? Vision, yes, obviously. Haptics, sound, smell. Well, it depends. It depends. So I'll go back to when I first got involved in VR back in July of 1987, courtesy of Steve Ellis and Scott Fisher, who were doing research into the kind of things that we started doing with Peter and Professor Shukshanov, into looking at how we can use virtual reality in space. This is my first ever experience using a very simple headset and a wireframe escalator. And it completely changed my career, completely changed my life. You know, my eyes told me I was going up, and my inner ear mechanism, my labyrinth, was telling me I was on solid ground. So I thought, this is interesting. This is a technology that will develop an awful lot of applications, but it's also technology that has a whole host of human factors needs. So that was quite an amazing experiment. And if you look at then and now, not that much has changed between what the guys at NASA were doing and what my team's doing at Birmingham in the UK. They were looking at situational awareness. They were looking at, could these astronauts in the future on International Space Station, could they practice extravehicular activity, EVA, or practice telerobotic control using VR so that they have a complete understanding of the risks of deploying humans and robots in and around the space station? What have we done very recently? We've done something very similar for the company Atlas Electronic. Again, this uses a very simple table, but what you have is that data space around you, which gives you information to the waterfall displays. It gives you access to a three-dimensional representation of the terrain. This was the start, and again, going back to Professor Harfouche, this is the start of looking at artificial intelligence in VR. Do we believe what the AI systems are telling us about that object? Is that a dangerous mine, or is that a supermarket shopping trolley? And what is the confidence level of what the system is bringing back? And do you actually believe that confidence level? So I have a PhD student at the moment who's looking into the whole issue of trust in future automation. But what Professor Harfouche was saying is absolutely spot on. You know, it's the human embedded within the AI image processing system, and sharing the knowledge and questioning what's being displayed to you, not to believe everything. So what are these two demos, the 1987 and the 2019-2018 having in common? So can we enhance situational awareness by using head-mounted displays, HMDs, or do we just use other non-wearable techniques? Do we exploit gloves or other non-wearable input techniques? What are the benefits and the advantages? Do we use purely virtual, or do we use some form of mixed media, multimodal content? What do we display? How do we display it? And what does it mean to the individuals? Might immersive technologies, as I call, compromise users' performance? How do we measure that? A big problem with VR at the moment is measuring performance. It's something that as human factors people we should be doing quite flexibly now, quite readily now, but there's still no golden design for carrying out experiments in VR. I guess, so how do we measure them? And how do we measure how the individual takes the skill, takes the knowledge from the real to the virtual skill transfer, and does providing them virtual experiences minimize fade of knowledge and skills? Again, we don't know at the moment. And obviously health and safety implications, something we have a duty of care to be very wary of all the time. So the same issues are there. 1987, 2021, the same issues persist to this day, which is why I decided that from my human factors background on, putting the human first, putting the user first, designing stuff that is appropriate for human use has to be the only sensible way that this technology will progress. Because if you buy the technology that's out there and you don't understand why you're using it and what your users need, you are going to fail. And it's happening all the time at the moment. So I'm sure you guys know this, but it's the simplest definition of human factors is a study of the relationship between the human and their working environment. And my premise is it makes absolutely no difference whether that working environment is real or virtual. It makes no difference whatsoever. Let me show you what I mean. I'm always a bit wary of showing these demos because they have been done by somebody else, but this was something that was on LinkedIn quite recently, and I looked at this and I thought, this is just not right. If you're trying to use a scalpel, why do you use virtual reality to train someone to put a pen to see what is up the guy's nose? Why? It's just beyond belief. And there's more examples and this is quite well filmed actually, because as you'll see from our project, it doesn't always happen like that. Your hand disappears into the body, and as you saw at the beginning, there was a third hand there. Somebody had three hands, and that third hand was shaking and distracting. And things like inserting needles, inserting catheters without any form of sensible haptic feedback, which does not exist yet, is simply not going to work. And I'll show you why. Here's another video. This talks about inappropriate use of expensive and advanced technologies. Look what this guy is doing. Graphics aren't too bad, the actual interaction, but this guy has a really, really expensive haptics feedback glove on his right hand, but he's doing 99% of the work with the Omni, well, I remember it as an Omni Phantom. It's a 3D Systems little stylus that gives you force and torque feedback, very, very limited. But this guy is doing all the work with his left hand, and this expensive glove is on his right hand, and it's only used every so often to put one finger into the hole. Now, that to me, you've spent all that money, and yet all you're using it for is just to put your finger into a hole. Absolutely crazy. So this is what I mean. This is an example of people buying this technology because it looks glamorous, because it looks sexy, and then we see examples like that. And really, the virtual reality or the XR community does not need examples like that, because it does no good for our credibility whatsoever. So they both demonstrate how important user-centered design is. And I believe that if you don't do this at the beginning and throughout a project, then you're going to break that project, and it's going to slow down the speed at which the market will adopt the solutions. And I think we're going to see that now for quite some time. People will buy these technologies, spend a lot of money, and just like the 1990s, as Peter will recall, they don't use it. It's just left to gather digital dust, I suppose you would call it, in some laboratory. Now, these guys are not the only ones who made the mistake. Again, back in the 1990s, we did too. And I think, I always put my hand up and say, we learn the lessons from our mistakes. And we were looking at keyhole surgery, minimally invasive surgery, or keyhole surgery as it's popularly referred to. And the idea was, could virtual reality then just replace the very basic skills trainers that these surgeons were trying to, when these surgeons were trying to graduate from open surgery to keyhole surgery? And they were using sweeties, they were using grapes, they were using chicken. Well, how do you measure when somebody is proficient to do a gallbladder operation by their performance using sweeties? And so the idea was, well, could virtual reality do that for us? And yet we went, we just went crazy. We said, fantastic, money from the UK's National Health Service. We've got to use the latest VR technology, haven't we? We must use this, the best tech that's out there. £250,000 supercomputer, which basically just did that. A haptic feedback device that looked like something out of the Ark, something from history. An autostereoscopic display that did not require the surgeons to wear glasses to visualize the 3D. And when we showed this to the surgeons, they walked away. They closed the door and they walked away, and we almost lost the funding because we'd fallen into that trap. We'd fallen into that trap as, yes, well, we've seen all this great technology, we must use it. But we went back into the operating theatre. I put my human factors hat back on, and we did a series of observation analyses of what the surgeons were doing, and we broke it down into what we call primitives, psychomotor primitives. And this is what they were trying. This is what they were trying to reproduce. Very simple movements. They didn't need to know what the liver looked like, or the gallbladder, or any other structure, the cystic duct here, because by the time they do this training, they know what they look like. So we're not teaching them about anatomy and physiology. We're teaching them to use handles. We're teaching them to work remotely, and that was a result. A fraction of the price of what we'd wasted in the previous year, and to the credit of human factors, it was actually the solution was sold to Mentis in Sweden, and that product not only became a European standard in keyhole surgery keyhole surgery training. It was on sale, and sadly I never saw a penny of this, which is in virtual reality is the story of our lives, I think. But it was on sale as Prostheticus Miss for 1997 to around 2010, and that was something that literally cost 1/100th of the price of the solution that we originally came up with, because we went back into the operating theatre and because we looked at the end users and we defined what it was they actually needed, not what we were being told they needed. So what did we learn? We learned that immersion using headsets is not a prerequisite for effective training. It's not. We learned that trying to get the greatest possible realism is not a prerequisite for effective training either. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to look like the liver, or the mesentery, or the gut. It doesn't have to look like that. You can symbolize it as long as the symbolization is being undertaken using human-centered design. Simply assuming that a piece of technology is bound to work based on what you see online is a recipe for disaster. Developing XR solutions without a sound human-centered design is foolhardy, and not engaging with end users until later in the design cycle is simply not acceptable. So we found much to our cost, although we managed to recover, virtual reality is not on its own going to change everything, despite what you may read. Potential adopters and investors must be protected from the hype and false promises. New and publicity-worthy startup companies are not at the moment sensible investment opportunities, and we'll see that because we're seeing startup companies beginning to die quite rapidly at the moment, because they've gone in with a technology and they've gone in with young, clever people who have got no business acumen, no business sense whatsoever. Concept demonstrators. Try to do a little demonstrator that de-risks major investment without being focused too much on technology, and the importance of future-proofing solutions. So you have to be very careful about what kind of software you use and how you archive it, because again, there are so many changes in particularly rendering toolkits that you need to be very, very wary that something you design today may not be usable in the same product 2 years in the future. Technology agnosticism. So agnostic about technology. Don't put the human first. Put the technology way down the list of importance. And that's why we do what we do. Humans first, technology second. It's been our battle cry now for a good 10, 20, maybe even longer, but putting the humans first and not being swayed by this. How do we do it? Very briefly, before I get onto my case study, there are two publications that we always say you need to have. These are our Bibles, and they're very basic, but they are very, very valuable. Number one is ISO 9241 Part 210, which is the ergonomics of human-system interaction, human-centered design for interactive systems. Now, very thin, quite expensive, but very thin, very readable. This is the main diagram, which I've not got time to go into, but we'll see elements of this design cycle, how we, for example, define the context of use, how we carry out task analysis and observations, and how we use that to specify what the end user really needs, how we then experiment with that, and how we do that in a cycle before we actually have a solution that meets the user requirements. So again, ISO 9241 Part 210, Bible number one. Bible number two, and in fact, you can get this classic book off the internet free of charge. It's now available in a PDF book, but it's still as important today as it was way back in, I can't even remember. I mean, my book, my version of this is falling to pieces. It's so tatty. I've had it for so many years. But Donald Norman, the designer of everyday things, comes up with this simple model of how we perceive the world, how we compare the perceptions with our goals, and we formulate a cognitive plan, and that cognitive plan then generates a sequence of action to change the world, and you go around this cycle. So you see something, you formulate a strategy, you then act, and that changes the world, and you see what you've changed. Now, what Donald Norman speaks about are what he calls the gulfs, the gulf of execution and the gulf of evaluation. Again, not much time to go into this, but I can do this by illustrating using the technologies I've been talking about. If you put a barrier between the world and the human, then you generate this idea of this gulf of evaluation, because that compromises the way you perceive the world. So, for example, putting a HoloLens or an augmented reality headset into something like an operating theatre looks great for public relations, but with all the glare and all the lighting and the reflection and what have you, is it really going to endow the surgeon with something that they can use? Similarly, with the more recent use of HoloLens for soldiers, for sort of combat and again situational awareness. There's been a lot of interesting articles online about how successful this has really been. I think time will tell. But again, using augmented reality in the outside world, we've already seen that doesn't work. It doesn't work very well at all. What about the gulf of execution? So as soon as you put that barrier between the human and how the human perceives and how the human executes the actions. So here we have haptic feedback system. We've seen the video of this particular system in action with the finger going in the hole. Why? And there are other technologies out there that effectively place a barrier of interaction between the human and the world. And what happens is that the human has to adapt to the technology before the human can actually perform the task. And that is, again, particularly for safety critical situations, that is a recipe for disaster. And all kinds of things could get wrong if your technology produces this barrier and stimulates these gulfs to exist. Negative transfer of training, skill fade, that means that the skills will diminish within days as opposed to months. Equipment that could be very unsafe when used in the real world. Malaise, so for example, sickness, nausea, and personal injury and injury to others. A lot more things could happen if this is not right. So how do we get this right? How do we try to try and make a difference? Well, here we have the ISO standard, and we've got the context of use, user requirements, and how we produce the solutions. Here we have Donald Norman's book, keeping our eyes focused on the barrier and how that will affect the perception and the execution. How do we do that? Peter's already put this picture up. You're in here again, Peter, by the way. This is a picture. We go and we observe, we go and we talk, we go, as Professor Harfouche said, we go and it's multidisciplinary. We go out there, we fly on the helicopters, we go on board the submarines, we try out the weapons, and we work with the end users, because you cannot do this behind a desk. This is all very nice and academic, but unless you can apply it in a multidisciplinary fashion with the end users, it's useless. So that's absolutely essential. And by doing that, we can then use the results to define how realistic the task has to be. Does it have to be completely photorealistic, engineering fidelity, or does it need to be partially realistic to achieve the psychological output we want? What about the context? Not just the task, but what's going on around you. How high in fidelity does that need to be? And what about the fidelity of the interactive device? Does it need to be a glove that doesn't perform? Or can you use an Xbox games controller? Or can you use the WASD keys on the keyboard? And this is all, a lot of this has been published. This is quite old now. This is 2012. But even though the case studies that are in this document are quite old now, and we use them again, a lot of the early part of the document is as relevant today as it was back in 2012. And again, if anyone's interested in that, I can send a copy to Peter, and and he can distribute it. So finally, what I'd like to do is just go through that approach using the project that we're currently working on. And we had some very good news 2 days ago in that our business proposal for phase 3 of this project has been accepted. So it looks as if in 2022 we will take our work and move it more towards an actual product. So it's Medical Emergency Response Team Training Project. Currently, these guys, these medics that take the casualties off the battlefield and keep them alive until they get back to a properly equipped hospital, currently they train using this £100,000 wooden box. So this is supposed to be representative of the rear of a Chinook helicopter. So the questions posed to us were, can virtual reality deliver an affordable, small team, dynamic content? And by that I mean simulating things that happen whilst the helicopter's in flight, exposure trainer, a more transportable solution. There are only 2 of these in the UK. It's crazy that you have to travel all the way and spend many days using this, and of course the expense that's associated. Can it be reconfigured? So can we switch from a Chinook helicopter to some other military platform like a hovercraft or a landing craft? And can we also please give attention to the instructor? Everyone thinks about the guys and gals who wear the headsets. Very few people think about what the instructor needs in order to be able to carry out this training and then review the training with the trainees after the training has happened. So 9241, first steps: plan the process, context of use, specify user requirements. So spent time at the tactical medical wing of RAF Bryce Norton, observing what these guys do, observing how primitive the equipment they have. These mannequins are falling to pieces. It's just incredible that these guys actually train, and it's well accepted that what they don't get is an idea of what it's like to be in a helicopter that's under fire, or a helicopter that's flying at night, or a helicopter that's landing in the dust. So it's very, very limited, but very expensive, very constrained, huge amounts of medical equipment. Now, again, are we going to recreate these virtually, or are we going to use them, or use the physical ones? Which are the more important? Which of them are the most important for training? What about space, entry, exit, emergency exit? What about hazards imposed by the onboard weapons? External, internal conditions, so what the helicopter brownout, night firing, night vision, and the effect on night vision of flares being fired, for example. So this is, again, lessons learned. I've talked about the MIST project. This was, again, blending elements of the real to make the virtual more believable. There are other projects. This is a Temporal Bone project that we did as part of a European project. And here they are using small haptic feedback, force and torque feedback devices to simulate drilling through the temporal bone area, which is here, of the ear. So we had to use technology to create the right sensations for these guys to perform their training. Helicopter voice marshalling. Very simple recreation of the side of a helicopter, because this guy has to lead out, he has to look under, and he has to be doing that whilst giving instructions to the pilot. So we're using a simple, realistic, physical environment to make the virtual, which is very simple. If you can see here, it's very, very simple, but to make that more believable and more relevant. Gunnery. These guys, when they're on board ship, not so much today because of the automated weapons, but when these guys are on ship, you can see they have to use their body to move that gun. So giving them an Xbox controller would be useless. So again, we used a blend of the real to make the virtual more believable. One of my favorite projects ever, which you can see I'm having a great time there, but again, looking at what these guys feel and sense when they're firing the weapon and reproducing it in a most appropriate form. Notice, without a headset, not necessary, absolutely not necessary. The bomb disposal system you've also seen, where unfortunately we were not involved in creating the control console for the Cutlass vehicles, but we had to make sure that the interface was closely matched, because it's no good getting the guys to control this robot using an Xbox hand controller when this is what they're confronted with in the real world. So all those examples, and we put all these lessons together in the concept design. Initially, very briefly, came up with this idea of an inflatable enclosure. The idea being that we wanted to make the guys who are training feel enclosed, feel as if, because sometimes when you're in a virtual world, if you put your hand up, it will go through the virtual ceiling. If you put your arm out, it will go through the side of the virtual fuselage. And that really is, it's so distracting, it's not true. Virtual Chinook, bought off the web, didn't cost very much money. Individual components, virtual components, again, bought from the web, didn't cost that much money. And we ended up with a modified virtual Chinook trainer. Okay, so here we have a virtual body on a virtual stretcher. Now, we also decided we want to try and simulate flight, but without having to go to the expense of a motion base, because the jury is still out on whether or not motion bases add anything extra to part task training. That's a discussion for another day. So what we do is we use our drone, again on Dartmoor in the West Country, flying backwards, and we then take that video and project it onto a billboard, a two-dimensional plane just outside the back of the virtual helicopter. Now, we get graphic images coming up. For those of you who don't like, this is our mannequin, our Trauma FX sim body mannequin, which we can modify to show different wounds, entry wound, exit wound, machete wounds, and so on. So this is the main physical element of the trainer. And what we wanted to do was to see if we could match our virtual hands with the virtual body, but at the same time, try to make sure that they coincided with the physical body. So when you reach out with your virtual hand and you touch the virtual body, the physical body is there as well. You can't see it. Now, if you cast your mind back to that video I showed, that was never going to work. Okay, so we carried out a number of evaluations. Just for a few seconds, watch my hands. There. So you saw the hands, disappearing into the body. You saw the hand flickering, and that was just as bad as that video that I showed a few minutes ago. And we tried all different kinds of solutions, and we looked at haptic feedback, and we thought, no, this isn't going to work. We need to touch the real thing. So we completely redesigned the project, and we went for this idea of mixed reality. And you can see here, my colleague Rob is wearing an HTC Vive Pro modified with a single DSEME camera. And we did the very simple experiment, which is showed here. This is our early experiment. So you can see there is the virtual hovercraft. Here's Rob's hands. He's seeing his hands. It's a little bit jerky because it was early days, but when he reaches out and touches the real mannequin, he actually touches the real mannequin. The hands don't disappear. He's moving the real mannequin's hands. He's opening the mannequin's eyes. And that was such a game changer for us in terms of what this mixed reality is definitely the way to go for the near-term future of training. So there's the setup we have. There's the Vario X3, which say we're probably hoping to go for the Lynx R1 when it's due out. But even with this solution, we can see you can read instructions on medevac manuals. You can carry out changes using Chinograph pencils, so you can get. It's not perfect, but it shows that you can use this to interact with the real elements of the training that matter. Evaluated this with the Royal Air Force back in May 2018. We were amazed by this video because these guys, okay, they tend to wear this kind of equipment anyway. But what we weren't ready for was the fact that they were corresponding, they were communicating, handing each other needles. Now, people say to me, your solution is not high resolution enough. Well, it's not, but they're handling needles, for goodness sake. You know, and this is quite incredible. They are communicating with each other. The revised enclosure in 2018 was this. So we went for a much larger inflatable enclosure. These white strips are basically the white zips here weren't color blue, so they stood out. But again, being able to carry out the interaction with the real and have various elements of the virtual made all the difference. And now we're moving to a much more modular approach where we're using a physical structure rather than inflatable to contain all of the equipment. And what we're doing is we're trying to work out which of the items of medical equipment are best included as real items, not virtual items, because a lot of these things would be incredibly expensive to model if we did everything in virtual reality. We don't have to do everything in virtual reality. In order to improve to make the virtual more believable, we spent a bit of time on using motion capture for the avatars, so the gunner, the pilot, the co-pilot, and again, it's important with this because we don't want this to distract them. Okay, we don't want these guys who are carrying out a separate operation in the rear of towards the back of the Chinook. You're actually performing on the physical casualty closer to the pilot. So we don't want them to distract them, but we don't want them to be flat or 2D, because again, that would not be believable above. So getting the blend right to make sure that the context impacts on the training but does not distract is part of the work. It's part of the work that we do. And finally, again, just thinking of what Professor DeMarco and Professor Harfouche were talking about in terms of multidisciplinary skills and getting people involved. We've been working very closely with the RAF. We've been flying with them. We're using GoPro cameras with the Royal Marines to film the external world. We've been on hovercraft landing craft and hovercraft, and it's all gone very well indeed. I think we're going to be changing some of these platforms for the next phase, but without the input of these specialists and end users, we were probably, as we did with that medical project all those years ago, we would probably give them something they can't use. And besides which, we have great fun doing this. I have to say, even at my age of 63, one of the reasons why I didn't retire is because I love doing this kind of thing. You can't take that away from me. It's part of the fun of doing research. So next steps, again, I mentioned the instructor's console. So we're concentrating on what the instructor needs to perform training effectively. We're looking at new platforms, new aircraft, because the next phase is going to be led by the RAF as part of the Astra Next Generation Technology Program. We are looking into smell. We will be working again with OVR. As I said, we've tried all these different solutions. The OVR olfactory display is the only one that really comes close. We are still desperate to find a smell that is realistic of the smell you get in a Chinook, which is aviation fuel or after. Nobody's been able to produce that yet, and that is interestingly that's the one smell that guys who go onto the Chinook remember. Not the stuff dealing with the casualty. It's the aviation fuel. And so that's a bit elusive at the moment, but we hope we may be able to introduce something that is is reasonably acceptable and doesn't distract. Otherwise, again, it'll take the trainees' focus away from their end use. So to conclude, lessons learned from the 1990s today: please beware of hype. Treat online claims with skepticism. As Peter knows, I do this every day on LinkedIn. I think sometimes Peter doesn't speak to me because of what I say on LinkedIn, but he will. It is important to question everything. Don't believe that VR and AR can do everything. They simply can't. Mixed reality actually may provide a better solution in the next few years. De-risking concept studies, mini projects to de-risk major investment in something that may not work is essential. And now, unlike the 1990s, we can make full use of online assets because they're affordable, they're animated, they're in formats that go straight into the virtual reality packages. Engage and maintain engagement with the end users and the stakeholders. That is something we've learned to our cost in the past, but we do every time we do a project now. Get out and do it. It just amazes me sometimes the number of people who design these virtual reality systems and they do it from behind a desk. That's unacceptable. And I say this to my students: avoid this mentality that everything can be done in a lab. It can't. We have to get them out and show them that if a good example, show them that if they put their electronics into the sea equals salt plus water, electronics goes bang. And sometimes it takes an experience like that for them to remember the practicalities of what they'll be doing in the future. Not, again, virtual reality centers. I'm not a fan of virtual reality centers. I'm not going to go into that, because that's for another day, another LinkedIn post, I think. I think also in terms of the work we do with our students and our research fellows is to foster vision and enthusiasm. And also I find that one of the biggest rewards that awaits us is STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and public engagements. Particularly in heritage, taking some of these things out, putting them in front of school kids, putting them in front of people, real people, from the members of the public, and watch them break the equipment is much better than even doing trials with the military. It's much better to get the feedback from these people, because if you don't, then these people are not going to go anywhere near the metaverse, if indeed the metaverse actually comes to pass. Virtual, augmented mixed reality, huge opportunity to revolutionize training, but there's not one headset out there at the moment that is totally fit for purpose. I know the vendors hate me for saying this, but it is true, especially in safety critical applications such as the military, such as surgery and hospital use. But of course, it's not all about wearing wearables, headsets, gloves, or whatever, which is good news. Haptic feedback, still really, I think, to be far too immature to be used safely in training scenarios, especially surgery. And effective training, as I mentioned before, does not require the greatest degree of realism, such as making sure that every bit of anatomy or physiology is modeled and the physics simulated. For many of the tasks that need to be performed, as we've seen, it's not essential. Have to exercise extreme caution when investing in VR. We've seen that over the years. We've learned that lesson very, very hard. Can the desired outcome be achieved reliably, safely, and cost effectively using other media approaches? Yes, of course you'll get in the newspapers, of course you'll get on the TV if you use virtual reality, but is that going to deliver what your end users actually need? You have to question that all along. And finally, do not believe everything you see and read online. You need to question the integrity and the motivation and the track record of those who typically overhype their offerings. So I hope, as Peter well knows, I can talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but you would all start screaming at me. So I'm going to call it a day there. I hope you've enjoyed that whistle-stop tour of the last 35 years, and it's been an absolute honor and privilege to spend a reasonable proportion of that time with the likes of Peter and Professor Shukshanov and all our friends and family down in Novocherkassk and in Moscow. So thank you very much for inviting me, Peter. I hope that's delivered what you want. And if there's time for questions, I'll take them. If not, do you want me to send the PDF of this presentation so you can distribute it to the people? Because I'm conscious there was a lot in there.